Hello, welcome back to another video. Today I'm doing my 15.1 mid-lane tier list. So for content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a bunch of changes this patch. It is a new season, so we saw a new objective, we saw minion changes, we saw a new item, and a bunch of these things combined with other things have completely changed the meta. We have seen a real rise in mages, we've seen a decline in assassins, we've seen other things just shift champions around. The likes of feats have had a pretty big impact within the mid lane, knowing that the tier up from Sorks is doing really well at the moment. It did get hotfix nerfed, but it is still a very performant item. And then Cassiopeia is something I'll talk about in a second, but she's definitely doing really well at the moment and definitely worth talking about. So the D tier then is going to consist of two champions, that is Smolder and Azir. Both these champions I'd really recommend avoiding in solo queue at the moment. Smolder basically gone from the mid lane, got quite aggressively adjusted in a previous patch, trying to focus down his wave clear and his level scaling, trying to amp up his gold scaling and pushing him towards the bot lane. They've been relatively successful. He's basically gone from both top lane and mid lane, and a pick I would recommend overall avoiding. In Azir's case, he is an incredibly pro-jailed champion, just not performant at the moment. His laning phase is really weak, and if you can get to his late game spikes, he can be a valuable DPS mage. But at the moment, it's just the laning phase being so weak is not enough of a payoff to, and like his late game not being as strong is just not enough of a payoff to really recommend picking the champion. Moving on to the C tier, then we have Twisted Fate, who has been in a pretty bad spot for a while. Champion definitely suffered from his AD strength when he was being played as a top laner. They just tagged him across the board a couple of times. They also tagged some of his AP ratios, as AP was doing decent at the time. Going after his point and click blue card AP ratio, quite aggressively nerfing that down. I think the champion could do with a bit of a buff, but in the current state, he just doesn't really do enough to solidify him as a good mid lane recommendation. The four assassins here are Fizz, LeBlanc, Zed, and Katarina. In the case of Fizz, he is just underperforming at the moment. Still good into immobile mages, but not really something I'd recommend picking outside of that. In Katarina's case, if you're a one-trick of the champion, you're still going to play it no matter where and how good the pick is. If you're not, she's just a pick I'd recommend avoiding. She is an incredibly hard to learn champion with a very, very steep barrier to entry. If she has high enough numbers, it tends to be worth, well, I mean, I not even tends to be worth, she's just a champion, but if you enjoy the playstyle of, you'll play her, and if you don't, then you'll probably end up avoiding her. Zed and LeBlanc, both still very frustrating in lower MMR brackets. In LeBlanc's case, she still functions well with an elite, just not great in low elo at the moment. In Zed's case, he's pretty bad across the board. You can still make both these champions work, especially if you give them enough gold and you're good enough at piloting them. The likes of BZ is a great player to look and watch if you are like a Zed enthusiast. LeBlanc is played by a bunch of high MMR players, and you can definitely get a good amount of tips and learnings to kind of pilot her in lower brackets, but these are two picks I'd just recommend avoiding at the moment. In Ziggs' case, he's been meh to bad for a while. He can function fine within the mid lane, especially if you are someone who puts a lot of time into him. There are better artillery mages which I would recommend over him at the moment. The likes of Vel'Koz, Xerath really are relatively decent, and Hui is a great option if you consider him under the artillery mage bracket. Jace, Ziggs is a really good bot lane. Like, if you want to play Ziggs anywhere, I recommend trying him in the bot lane. I say really good. He is a good bot lane option. He has been better. They did tag him slightly, so he sits as more like a decent option there. And then Jace, obviously gained a bunch of popularity from Arcane. If you're playing him in the mid lane, I traditionally recommend sticking with the lethality variant, where you are playing like Youmu's into your full damage builds, and just not really ever going to be Unending Despair variant. After the nerfs towards Unending Despair, it just isn't very performant. It was already a relatively situational build where you couldn't really, where you were playing into a bunch of melees, and like the durability meant that you could kind of function as like a fighter more than like a skirmish assassin. Right now, I'd recommend just going that build, and yeah, you should find success. Well, I say success. You will be able to pilot the champion. He's still not a pick I'd really recommend unless, once again, you put a lot of games into him. Yasuo and Yone are going to be two of my picks within the B tier. Once again, very high mastery champions. Like, if you put a lot of time into them, you'll get rewarded. If you don't, they're not picks I'd recommend as like go-to options, but they are solid AD picks and they are very popular, so they do exist there, and they are definitely champions which at some point I would recommend learning if you are playing mid lane. Especially Yone, he tends to pop up within the meta every so often and be a like very functional pick there, especially like the Sejuani Yone pairings into like the Victor at the moment. But yeah, Echo gonna be within my B tier. I think the champion has lost a decent amount of its value, which it had from like previous seasons. Kind of like Diana. I think both these champions just on the down at the moment. With nerfs towards some of the higher tier champions, I could definitely see these picks like gaining back some of the spots they've lost. But right now, I do think assassins just in general are a bit too volatile, inconsistent, and just not as good as some of the major options at the moment, which is why I have these two a bit lower down. Diana, definitely, she was quite heavily performant in the previous season, working really nicely as like this really aggressive early game mage with a mage assassin with a lot of damage and a lot of harass potential. Just not doing as well at the moment, so she does find herself within the B tier. And Zoe, if you get the gold and you're like piloting the champion well, she can be really oppressive. She still has a play pattern of just wanting to close out games as quick as possible. If you find yourself going long within games, this champion will quite heavily fall off. She's not level bound as much as like some of the other mid lane options, and you really feel that when the game is going like level 13 beyond, she really struggles quite a bit more in those game states. Asol, on the flip side, is an incredibly heavy, level stack scaling champion. Scales incredibly badly with MMR. Like, this champion, great within lower MMR brackets where the games go traditionally quite long. Really bad, basically non-viable within higher MMR at the moment. So I'd recommend avoiding Asol in his current state. Could probably do with being buffed, but he sits as like a B tier option, primarily because he's still a very solid option in lower MMRs where, yeah, the games go long enough to be a consistent champion. If you want a build tip at the moment, I'd recommend trying Bloodletter's Curse and like really seeing how the item feels on him, as it's definitely something which I've seen pop up a bit more over time. Kassadin sits within the B tier. I say he's kind of like Asol. He's not like as low elo like skewed. He's a bit more matchup dependent. Like, if you can get the correct matchups as Kassadin, scale up to the spikes you want to be, he can be a really valuable champion to the draft. But he got nerfed more recently. The AP ratios once again have been tagged, and I think he belongs more as a B tier option at the moment. But if you're playing the right spots, he can be a very valuable champion. Kiana, on the flip side, is actually higher than she traditionally is. I think Kiana, she's an incredibly elite skewed champion. This is obviously very well known. Like, if you can pilot Kiana well, she is a very valuable pick. She's actually doing a bit better just across like general brackets at the moment. She's still not a pick I would recommend, but if you enjoy Kiana, she's definitely there and an option for you. The Fury on the other side is not great. Like, this champion suffers really badly at the moment. I think she could honestly go all the way down to the C tier. I'm going to put Neferi in the C tier. I just don't think this champion's a pick I would really recommend. Well, okay, so Neferi as a pick is very low MMR skewed. If you want an AD option which will get you to something like Plat, she's probably one of the best there for you. Past that, though, I would just recommend dropping the champion. I think she could probably do with some tweaks to kind of enable her to be better within, like, more generalistic, without, like, giving her some more laning power and, like, shipping some of that, like, real late game, like, level kind of lock power which she has going on. It'll be interesting to see, but for the moment, I would recommend avoiding the champion. I'd have her as like a low B tier, like C tier option. I just wouldn't really recommend Neferi in her current state. Talon sits in the B tier as well. Once again, another assassin, not doing as well at the moment. Received like a slight durability nerf towards the end of last season as well. I think he sits in the B tier in his current state. Corki. Gorky, I think I had pretty heavily underrated this champion. I still think it's better within the bot lane, and I still recommend playing him there. But you can definitely make mid lane Corki work. He's still very oppressive in his early levels. His wave clear is very good, and it allows him to like functionally be quite potent for like the first 20 minutes of the game. If the game goes on longer than that, this champion really falls off quite aggressively compared to most other options. But he's still a ranged DPS or damage champion, and you can still get value out of him. So I think he belongs as like a B tier pick at the moment. Brand is bad, like arguably just another pick, kind of like Nefarian Acer, which should be better for the like audience he is like targeted towards. Like Brand is a good low MMR option, but once you get like past plat into like Emerald Diamond, this champion falls off quite aggressively, and once again is back to being a pick I just wouldn't really recommend, purely because he's not as as consistent like the higher up you go. Annie is a bit better at the moment. I think she sits as like a high B tier option. Is she a pick I'd recommend learning at in her current state? Probably not. But the build being like your Malignant into, I believe, Storm Surge or Shadow Flame is performant to an extent. She's not as cookie cutter as she has been in previous iterations, and I would say she's like a tier of difficulty above like your Brands, your Neferis, your Acers, but she's still relatively accessible for the average player base. And if you want someone who is going to give you a point and click stun, is a summon champion, then Annie is still a very solid option there for you, so I have her in the B tier. Aksham, if you're going like the static collector build, he's pretty solid. A good AD option, tends to be a bit on the elite skewed side. It can be quite obnoxious, especially if you give him an advantage. I would have him as like a slight tier above like Yasuo's and Yones. Maybe not like quite an A tier option, but like a high B tier. If you're good at him, you'll make him work, and you'll definitely be able to climb all the way to master most likely. But you do need to put the games in. You really need to learn the champion. He's not someone you can just pick up and be good at from the get-go. Zeref doing a bit worse at the moment. Still a solid artillery mage. I just have him a slight tier below Vel'Koz in his current state. But if you give him the gold, then once again he can be really oppressive. He's very good into specific compositions, which just don't have the tools to deal with artillery or are susceptible to that kind of range. Vladimir, now that we've kind of moved on past like your Grasp W max Vladimir's, he's fine. Like he's a solid B2 option. Once again, like a lot of the champions on this list, if you snowball, convert your advantage then he can be very valuable. If he's gonna be a bit harder to pilot than some of the other options, which is why I traditionally have him as more like a B tier option, but he could contest quite comfortably with a lot of the A tier picks. Vex is a bit more conditional. I think this champion can be A tier. I think it can also be B tier depending on what kind of draft you're playing her into. She wants to obviously be into like the high dash compositions where you can rotate your passives more consistently. You do have like the two builds where you're playing like more for your CDR build. I believe that's like the Blackfire Lucids build, or you can play like the full burst build of like your Ludens, your Sorks, and both can work quite nicely at the moment. So I think she sits as like a high B tier option. Silas is a bit more conditional now, but still very solid if you pick him in the right spots. Obviously the ultimate can really depend, like really change the outcome of the game. Like picking Silas into a Malphite, for example, massively increases your odds of winning. It is one of the most polarizing matchups in the game. He still struggles into some of the matchups which just kind of nullify his ability to really fight back in lane, like your Anivias, your Cassiopeias. These can be really hard for him, but I have him as like a solid B tier option in his current state. Akali, another one, could be considered A tier, could be considered B tier. If you get an advantage on her, she can be really oppressive. I think she's a great AP assassin in her current state. If you enjoy her, definitely a pick I would recommend. Orianna and Aurora wrap up the B tier, as are like I'd say Vladimir up, or even like Zeref and Akshan. I'd say these picks here are like your high B tiers, could be considered A tiers. Like they're not really locked to this kind of position. Orianna compare really nicely with AD junglers at the moment, considering I believe it was like 9 out of the top 10 junglers at the moment, like popular junglers at the moment, are AD, and then you have like Diana as your AP option. Orianna can synergize really nicely with like your Jarvans, your Xin and really enable them to be just more potent in what they can provide. So Orianna, sits as like a high B tier option. Tends to be a bit harder to pilot, and like the lane can really change the like value of this champion. So I don't think she's quite A tier, but yeah, solid B tier. Aurora, obviously pickable in both top lane and mid lane. It's a bit harder to pilot and can really struggle in lane to a lot of the mage options at the moment. But in the mid game, if you're able to consistently like land your ult in good positions and then utilize her kiting potential, she can be really valuable and like output a huge amount of damage. So once again, this is like a high B tier option. Moving on to the A tier then, the likes of Swain I think are better within lower MMRs if you are looking for a champion which can be a good frontline / mage option. But, then Swain is a good pick still there for you. He has been nerfed, and I do think he is not quite like the old Swain, but people enjoy him a bit more at the moment, and I think he could sit as like a low A tier option. Could be interchangeable with some of the B tier picks. The likes of Ahri, Lissandra also fall into this bracket. I think Ahri's a bit weaker this season, but still a very good option, especially if you're looking for a bit more of a like high mobility burst mage option. Lissandra tends to be a bit more counterpick dependent, but if you can get her into matchups where you can get a lot of ult value, then she is a great pick there for you. Ryze and Vel'Koz are like my other lower down mage options. I think Ryze great into short range compositions, which you can nullify like the potency of some of it, like these picks. The likes of Sylas, for example, Ryze is incredible into. Definitely a champion I'd recommend trying him in like as an option into. Vel'Koz is probably the best like traditional artillery mage option. Hui is, I think, the best, but like Vel'Koz very, very good if you're looking for like a traditional pick. I think Hui falls into this bracket of like, I don't know if I want to call him an artillery mage, but he has like the traits of an artillery mage. So yeah, I think he can be like considered both if that's like your ID, like what it depends on like what your ideology of it is. So yeah, Vel'Koz as an option, still very good at the moment, still offers a load of damage, and that ult CD buff was huge for him. It really did help him, and he can now consistently like fight back a lot against a lot of the champions within the mid lane. Moving on from these 5 picks, we have Neeko, who very unpopular at the moment. It's very unfortunate. Like Neeko's mid lane pick rate is definitely one of the lowest it's been. She looks to be more popular in support in her current state, and I've actually seen 2 Neeko jungles, in fact, like on my climb back up to master. So Neeko, definitely a pick I would recommend. Trying within mid lane. I think she's definitely got a lot of power, especially in early laning phase. But she's not like a necessity in her current state. I think she is just a good option. Then we have a bunch of the top laners, which I think can be kind of interchangeable and can be dropped down, moved up, depending on what kind of spots you pick them into. The likes of Malphite, great as an anti-AD option, sucks into some of the mages. You can obviously have the fallback pattern of AP Malphite, which I think drops him down to the B tier quite comfortably, but if you pick him in the right spots, into the right comps and the right build, then I think this champion can deliver very consistent results. Don't pick him all the time though. He's situational. I'd have him as like a low A tier for that reason. Gragas, I think, is a relatively underrated mid laner, obviously relatively unpopular, kind of like Kayle, but both these picks, if you pick them in the right spot, can be very solid AP options. Kayle obviously wants to like come out into drafts which struggle with wave clear and like pushing, and she can oftentimes like freely scale up. She is very powerful on obviously 2 items and definitely works really nicely as a mid and top option. Pantheon sits within the A tier at the moment. I think this champion performs a bit better in the mid lane, especially into like your specific matchups like Yasuo's and Yone's and some of your assassin options. I think that's why he's doing a bit better. If you pick him into mages, you can definitely struggle. Merc treads are in a pretty bad spot at the moment, being very expensive and like oftentimes hard to pick up, but like you can go things like Hexdrinker and still definitely have value into those options. So Pantheon sits as an A tier option. Then my other 2 top laners are Cho'Gath and Garen. I believe Garen, obviously, for his simplicity and his real inability to be killed within the mid lane. Like, this champion just has a lot of like passive regen, and his durability is just very high, and going something like a phase rush build just makes him very hard to lock down, and I think he is a very valuable option. In fact, the person who hit Challenger first within EU West, pretty sure is a Garen mid player. Like, I'm pretty sure it was Zhao, who is like, yeah, a Garen mid/top interchangeable, I believe, Garen player. And then Cho'Gath, I think Cho'Gath's in a very solid spot for both roles as well. Definitely a bit simplistic. His skill shots are relatively easy to judge, but he's definitely been buffed up enough that he's a pretty stat sticky tank. And if you get onto someone, you'll oftentimes just out trade and even just burst them down 100 to 0, especially if you're playing like an AP build variation. My other 5 mages in the A tier could arguably be contestable with some of the S tier options. The likes of Talia, I think, is in a relatively decent spot in the mid lane at the moment. She tends to be kept on the strong side to like maintain popularity. Veigar, great within lower MMR brackets, tends to fall off quite aggressively the higher up you go. I think that's probably what prohibits him from being an S tier option at the moment. But if you are looking for something to get to plat, Veigar is a great option there for you. Anivia, slight tier below where she has been in the past. She, I believe, received a nerf to her E flat damage and her durability, which has just taken her down a slight tier. She's still a very good option and a bit niche, but if you enjoy this champion, then she's still a very good pick there for you. And then Hui and Syndra. Syndra doing a bit better at the moment. Hui also doing quite well. I think both these picks are considered like very good meta staple mid laners. They usually have like viability in most metas, and like their long range CC abilities combined with their burst damage and like consistent damage output just make them very valuable options. So 2 picks I would very much recommend learning, especially if you are like someone who enjoys playing a lot of mid lane. Moving on to the S tier then. Lux, I feel like, has been here forever. Like, this champion is obviously very popular just across the board in both support and in the mid lane, but never is really appreciated for just how strong she is. Her base damage is high, her burst, her like gold like scaling are all very nice. I actually played against Kerberos, who has been playing like a tank Lux build variation. I think it's terrible. I wouldn't recommend trying that, but he's found success, so it can definitely be something that works. But overall, Lux, I think, is in a great spot at the moment. You don't really need to interact with the wave a lot of times. You can just ER and like look to roam onto sides. Her mobility, if you're going things like Symbiotic Souls, or you have like an early Sorks combined with maybe like a Shorelia, like I've seen utility Lux variants, like she just has a lot of builds, and I do think Lux is in a very good spot at the moment, so she does sit within the S tier. Galio, great into like the AP options, being so many of them at the moment. I think this champion can quite nicely come out as a great counter pick, being relatively simple to play, like has a large margin for error, great utility, decent agency, decent base damage. I think this champion just has a lot of things going for him at the moment, and very deserving of an S tier spot. Malzahar, one of the easiest mid laners to play in the game. You press E, you press W, you clear wave, you press R on target, you'll kill them. Ta-da! You should get yourself a lot of LP, all the way up to like Emerald. This champion should be a great option there for you. His builds are in a very good spot at the moment. Combined with the fact that he's receiving a quality of life buff next patch, it's not really going to change much, but he's in a good spot at the moment, so definitely a champion I'd recommend learning. Aurelia and Victor wrap up my S tier. Victor, obviously, has skyrocketed in his presence. I believe he is the most popular mid laner in the game. Yeah, by quite a mile, actually. This champion obviously received a bunch of changes when they did the Arcane ASU on him, buffing up his ultimate, buffing up his they buffed up like a lot of things. Like, actually basically all of his abilities got buffed up. His Q, his W, his E, like E mana cost, Q shield, I believe, and W consistency. And yeah, all these changes really did help him. They hotfix nerfed him, nerfed his durability down. It made him slightly weaker, but he's still very performant within the mid lane. He is being nerfed in 15.2, so if you do enjoy playing Victor, I'd recommend playing him now before he gets nerfed, and probably drop down to like an A tier option. And in Aurelia's case, they've caught on. She's also being nerfed in 15.2. She was performing incredibly well with Hullbreaker. They are nerfing her very hard. I do believe this champion will drop quite substantially. But if you enjoy her and you're good at her at the moment, like if you're not good at Aurelia, you probably shouldn't be playing her. But if you are good at Aurelia and or you're willing to learn her before the end of the patch, she is a pick which you should probably be playing a lot of. And then Cassiopeia, who is the best mid laner in the game at the moment. She really benefited from the fact that she got buffed because of the feats and the fact that she doesn't build boots. They had to do something to her passive to like really make her quite like able to kind of like maintain her position within the mid lane. They overdid it, and she's performing too well at the moment. If you get feats on Cassiopeia, she is one of the best champions within the game. She is traditionally in a good spot though at the moment. Like, she works really nicely into a lot of the short range mid laners. She suffers into artillery, but considering like the main things you're going to be concerned of, maybe like your Victors, your Hueys, your Sindras, the other ones don't tend to be as popular. She's fine, and I think Cassiopeia is a great flex option, can be played in the top lane, and if you get your items and you get like complete your build, she is an incredibly potent pick, and definitely something which I would recommend playing a lot of on the current patch. When she gets nerfed though, probably will go down a bit, probably find herself back within the S tier, but at the moment she's going to be my S plus option, as I believe she's an incredibly strong spot. Maybe you could like drop her down, but I want something within the S plus tier, so Cassiopeia is going to be my pick of the patch. Thank you guys for watching, I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.